I want to talk about David Ludwig's book, Always Hungry. David Ludwig is a physician and researcher at Harvard Medical School. I believe he's the director of the pediatric obesity clinic there. In Always Hungry, he promotes the idea of the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. Carbohydrate insulin model of obesity suggests that carbohydrates, when consumed, cause an increase in insulin, which causes the energy that is consumed to be stored into fat. Since that energy is stored into fat and not available in the bloodstream, it's trapped in the fat. The body doesn't have enough energy to run itself because all the energy is in the fat instead of being available. When this happens, the person becomes hungry because they don't have enough energy, so they become hungry again very quickly. And the person becomes tired, so they stop moving. They become lazy, essentially. And because of this, becoming hungry and lazy, they eat more and move less. So actually carbohydrates, according to this model, cause people to eat more and move less, and thereby to gain weight and to become obese. This is the model of obesity presented in Always Hungry. It's also the model that David Ludwig is the chief proponent of in the medical literature. For example, in a paper called The Carbohydrate Insulin Model of Obesity, Beyond Calories and Calories Out by Ludwig and Ebeling, Ludwig promotes this theory of obesity. And then, in response, Kevin Hall and Stefan Guyenet point out many problems with the theory. One of the points that Ludwig makes is that even though many societies eat a low-fat diet, eat a high-carbohydrate diet, and don't become obese, the carbohydrate insulin model still accounts for that because other factors besides carbohydrate can still account for obesity. But he only discusses this in a couple paragraphs in that particular paper. And he says all these other factors, etc., all these other factors that people talk about often, yes, they are related to obesity as well. And they are an important mediator of obesity besides carbohydrate insulin and insulin intake. But then the question is what is the most important mediator of obesity? If these other factors can modify the role of carbohydrate in obesity, then wouldn't that make those factors more important? Well, it depends, and you'd have to actually look at this. Dr. Ludwig has looked at this to some degree in a paper called, I can't actually pull it up here, but there is a really important paper where he talks about how, through what's called Mendelian randomization, he talks about how between 1 and 10% of obesity, according to the most liberal estimate, is explained by insulin, variations in insulin between people, insulin secretion. And if that's the case, then the carbohydrate insulin model is only can only play a modest role in obesity, according to his own research. So the question is if carbohydrate insulin model, according to Dr. Ludwig, if it, quote, offers a comprehensive paradigm beyond a focus on one macronutrient to address the major drivers of fat accumulation and metabolic dysfunction, what are the other variables in that paradigm? What are their relative importances? And could they be more important than insulin and carbohydrate? And the evidence seems to suggest that's the case. If you look at two other studies, Diet Fits by Gardner and a metabolic ward study by Hall. These are the studies that were funded by NUSI, the organization that Gary Taubes created, that tried to test the carbohydrate insulin model. And these show no results. That is to say, they show that carbohydrate intake doesn't account at all whatsoever. It does not account whatsoever for the differences in energy expenditure in Dr. Hall's study or for weight gain in Dr. Gardner's study. Dr. Ludwig had his own study through NUSI, that study was highly controversial. Which gets to the point. If you write a book about obesity, about a diet book, and you promote a certain set of dietary paradigms, these paradigms should be firmly established in the evidence-based. They shouldn't be controversial. If you're trying to promote a book based on controversial dietary paradigms, then you're not basing it on paradigms that have been rigorously tested and demonstrated. And when you're doing that, and you're claiming that your paradigm explains obesity to the public, you're overhyping your findings. And that's a form of misinformation. Because you're telling the public that something is true when it's in fact potentially, quite potentially, and according to many scientists, probably untrue. Now, Dr. Ludwig believes it's true. But the evidence is the evidence, and the evidence is ambiguous. If you look, again, back at Dr. Hall's study, Ludwig had a lot of problems with Dr. Hall's study. Dr. Hall made a meta-analysis showing that if you look at all the studies comparing low-fat and low-carb diets in metabolic ward situations, you don't have any advantage to the low-carb diet over the low-fat diet. In fact, you have an advantage to the low-fat diet in terms of energy expenditure. Dr. Ludwig criticized this meta-analysis, and he criticized Dr. Hall's study. But nonetheless, there's still an area of controversy here. The fact is that highly prominent scientists, one Dr. Hall at the NIH and one Dr. Ludwig at Harvard, are arguing about this, shows that this is a controversial view. It's a controversial topic, and to claim and to propose that it is correct, that the carbohydrate insulin model is correct, and to suggest that that is the path forward is irresponsible. Let's give an example about how dangerous and bad this can be. If you look at the low-fat era, which is something that Dr. Ludwig likes to criticize at great length, the populations that consume low-fat diets, on which essentially Pritikin based his low-fat ideas on, these populations that had low-fat diets, that had low rates of chronic disease, that had low rates of obesity, they were eating highly unrefined diets. But then the message that low-fat is the most important part of the whole paradigm, which wasn't necessarily held by all the people who were involved in the formulation of the original dietary guidelines. Many of those people didn't think low-fat was necessarily the most important part, and was the unprocessed nature of the foods that was the most important part. Yet, the low-fat part of it became the predominant part, and so long as you just didn't have fat, you didn't eat fat, you couldn't get fat. That became the mantra. And yet what we got these frankenfoods filled with junk that weren't necessarily even low-fat, that called themselves low-fat even, and that weren't potentially quite fattening. Highly processed foods that were quite fattening, even though they were quote-unquote low-fat. If you believe that the low-fat theory is correct, and that is the only reason why societies that eat low-fat diets are lean and healthy, and then you promote that to the public, you can get unintended consequences of the public eating low-fat junk and becoming obese, potentially, even if it's not low-fat, let's say. This isn't the only place that you can have unintended consequences. You can have this in all sorts of different places, where you get the theory wrong, and because you're getting the theory wrong, you derail public policy. So this is considered possibly dangerous because it's promoting a fad diet. But on a deeper level, anything that promotes a fad diet or any kind of misinformation is actually quite dangerous. Because if this misinformation becomes a dogma, it becomes a meme that then causes us to go off in a direction that actually doesn't address the core problem, the root problem that's causing the issue that we're concerned with. Then we waste time and we get sidetracked, and then we potentially even make the problem worse. And so it's for this reason that you should only recommend and support and advocate for theories that are strictly and robustly based on the evidence, rather than your own pet theory. Certainly one can say pragmatically that this or that thing might work and may work and may be worth trying. That's really good. But to promote a theory, a scientific theory that may be false as true, is not good, it's bad. We need to promote only theories that are robustly based on the evidence, not theories that are weakly based on evidence. And so this is an overhyped, possibly dangerous book, promoting a fad diet that's not based on rigorous, robust evidence base that is promoted before we have properly tested the theory. Thanks for watching the video.